Take Africa on Channel Africa, the African perspective. One thing I didn't do at the beginning of the show was to kind of make sure that we are all on the same train. Social media, that's where we are at Channel Africa One, across the social media platforms. Please reach out. We'd like to hear what's on your mind. Also, are you loving what's happening in the studio? It's the only way we'll find out at Channel Africa One across board. And I'm loving that voice. It just reminded me of back in the day when Boys to Men, they still are, what the hottest thing, they still are. That voice that started that song, Kavaile, I think it's Ndingo Joa's voice. It was just too crisp, man. Love it for us on a Sunday morning. All right, let's get straight to the business of the day. There is going to be a conversation that is going to happen right now. And I do have my guest in studio. It's Bruce Turvey, executive at Change Logic. They provide all kinds of solutions, but we are all about technology, so we want to hear how they align in that perspective. There's training solutions and engagement solutions. So when deploying change from a technology perspective, the success factors should be clearly defined beforehand, and everyone should be educated on what the digitalization or digitization process really entails. Applying the Global Insights report to the local market. We do have my guest in studio. It's Bruce. Good morning, Bruce.
Morning, Puleng.
Thank you for joining us this morning. We woke you up on a Sunday morning.
Hey, thank you very much for having us. It's a privilege to be here, and you can wake me up as early as you like.
Oh, okay. No, we will every day. All right. So we want to start the conversation here, Bruce. I mean, in your opinion, what does good and bad change management look like?
Well, that's a brilliant question. I think as a good change manager, I must just give a little bit of context.
Yes.
So your change management is a practice that's sort of maturing. I think it grew predominantly out of the sort of 90s and 2000s. If you can remember then, Puleng, there was a lot of innovation around technology, especially big systems, ERP systems like SAP and Oracle that were going into organizations. And that was globally as well as in South Africa. A lot of study was done at that time about how much money was spent on technology. And for want of a better term, that's digitization as well. And what was found is a lot of projects actually didn't succeed despite the technological cost and the expense associated with putting in big tech. And the big finding was the human element of that. So literally the adoption of that technology. So you can imagine if you've got an incredible technology that you implement into a business, if it's not utilized properly, and we talk about adoption a lot, then you're not actually going to get the return on that money. So what that sort of kicked off was a huge development of change management as a practice. So what do we have to do around that human element to ensure that we got the return on investment for the technology spend that we were undergoing? And you mentioned it. You know, what outcomes are we trying to drive? And I think for any big technological or digitization effort, you need to look at what those outcomes are before you kick off, and that's often part of the problems with good or bad change management and the value you get out of technical processes. So if you can imagine organizations historically do a lot of things manually, like paper-based work, or even later on Excel-based work. If you take those business processes and you automate them, that's a form of digitization. And that you can imagine that gives an organization a lot more effectiveness, a lot more simplicity, and then over time strategic advantage. More recently, with the proliferation of tech, which as I'm sure you're seeing probably even more than me, it's prolific. The amount of technology out there is actually it's almost too much for us as humans to get our heads around. And this is one of the problems that businesses have. What tech do they choose? Because there's so much of it. And that's what digital transformation is when it's fundamentally changing how your business operates. It literally impacts your operating model. I think a good example is telcos. If you think about 10, 15 years ago, if you needed more airtime or you needed to change a contract, you'd get on the phone, right? And you'd stand in the queue at the call center. Digital transformation is taking all of that human interaction with your organization and trying to push it onto platforms, right? So now, instead of phoning the call center, and banks are doing the same thing, they're trying to get you to use an app rather. Because that fundamentally changes the operating model of your business. Your call center gets smaller and effectively your tech center gets bigger. But you're creating a simpler, better and quicker and more cost-effective engagement with your customer. So from a change management point of view, you can imagine how that fundamental change to your operating model changes how you work internally. So back to your point, is if we're going to embark upon digital transformation within an organization, the change management becomes absolutely critical. If we assume that you have picked the right technology, then question number 2 is, are we entirely committed to the implementation of that technology? Implementing tech is incredibly disruptive. It's hugely disruptive, and in fact, the amount of disruption it creates in your organization is typically underestimated. So it's like anything, you have to be really committed if you want to succeed, because it comes again to those trade-offs. So once you're committed, then the third thing is you really have to free up resources to follow through. It's not something that you can do as a hobby. And often what we see, and particularly in the change management space, is, well, we don't want to spend the money on the project management and the change management required to put this technology in. So if we're not committed there, then what you find is a project that should have taken 1 year can take 2 or 3 years. So it's almost like buy cheap, buy twice, if that makes sense. And these elements are hugely important. Then probably on number 4, and because I'm a change manager and because you're asking me, I'm going to tell you, is focus very heavily on adoption. And by user adoption, I mean, you're going to put in this incredible technology. This technology is so feature rich and has so much capability right now that we're not going to extract value if we're using 1% of that technology or 2. We've got to try and push that marker as high as we can. If I ask you what cell phone you have, you're going to tell me I've got a Samsung or an Apple. How much of the functionality of that device do you think you use?
For me, it's 60%.
You think 60?
The other 40, I'm not interested.
You see, I think 60 is high. I think I use probably 1% of the capability of my handset. You think of all the capabilities that this handset can deliver.
Maybe, but they are there for like those in-demand features. So, 100%. They will prioritize those in-demand features, and I use 50% of those in-demand features. Then
you're good, and you're above average. So I think we don't know what we don't know. We don't know how much capability these devices have. And similarly with technology that we implement into organizations. Another great example is if you just take Microsoft products. Often what you find is these organizations spend a lot of money on a group license, for example, hundreds of millions of rands. Microsoft has an incredible amount of capability.